The room smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive cologne. My husband stood at the front of the conference table, laughing with a group of executives as if he owned the place. Technically, he didn't, but the way he spoke to people, the way he leaned back in the chair and gave instructions, you would think the entire building belonged to him. When I walked into the room, he barely looked up. "Oh," he said casually to the others, gesturing toward me. "This is my wife." Just my wife. The room chuckled politely. Someone asked if I was there to drop something off. I didn't answer. Instead, I quietly took a seat at the end of the long table. Because in less than 5 minutes, the board meeting was going to begin. Oh, and when the chairman announced who actually owned the company, my husband would finally understand something he had never bothered to ask. When I first met Daniel, he spoke like a man who had already decided what kind of person I was. Not in an obvious way, nothing rude at first. He was charming, polished, the kind of man who made waiters laugh and remembered everyone's name. He held doors open, asked the right questions, knew exactly how long to look someone in the eye before smiling. From the outside, he was impressive. My father used to call men like that well-trained. At the time, I thought it was a compliment. Looking back, I understand what he really meant. Daniel came from a family that had spent years orbiting around our company. His father had worked in one of our regional offices for nearly 2 decades. Reliable, ambitious, I'd always eager to be seen. The kind of employee who stayed late when executives were visiting and remembered birthdays that could help him move up. Daniel inherited the same instinct. He loved power. Or maybe more accurately, he loved proximity to it. At dinner on our 3rd date, he asked me what I did. I told him I worked in asset management and sat on the board of a private holding company. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. He nodded politely, clearly only half interested. "Corporate work seems exhausting," he said. "I'm glad I'm more on the operational side." Then he spent the next 15 minutes explaining how companies really ran, how leadership often got too much credit, how the people on the floor were the ones who kept businesses alive. He said all of it with the confidence of someone who assumed I would be impressed. I mostly listened. Have you ever watched someone talk around you instead of to you because they've already decided what you could not possibly know? That became a pattern. The more we saw each other, the more I noticed it. If we passed one of my buildings downtown, he would comment on how much waste executive offices probably had. If his father mentioned something about company policy, Daniel would shake his head and explain what management never understood. And always, somewhere inside those conversations, there was the same quiet assumption that I was just a woman listening, just his girlfriend, later just his wife. Nothing more complicated than that. It wasn't that I hid who I was. I simply never made a show of it. The company had been placed into a trust after my grandfather died. Ownership was structured carefully, privately, and legally for reasons my family had understood very well. Public visibility brought problems. So my mother taught me early to move quietly, ask more questions than I answered, and never correct someone who was eager to underestimate me. "People reveal themselves faster when they think you're harmless," she used to say. Daniel certainly did. And by the time we got married, I knew one thing clearly. He loved the idea of being important far more than he loved the discipline required to understand what real power looked like. After we got married, the small comments started appearing more often. Not insults, nothing loud enough to start an argument, just quiet reminders of how Daniel saw the world and where he believed I fit inside it. Most mornings began the same way, coffee brewing in the kitchen, the soft sound of emails arriving on our phones, Daniel reading business news while explaining what companies were doing wrong. Sometimes he talked about executives like they were distant figures who barely understood their own organizations. "People at the top never see the real work," he would say, shaking his head. I would nod quietly and take another sip of coffee, because correcting him would have changed the conversation in ways I wasn't ready for. At dinner with his parents, the tone was similar. His father often talked proudly about the company he worked for. Long hours, major projects, senior leadership meetings. Daniel listened carefully, occasionally offering his own opinions about how the company should really be run. Once, during one of those dinners, his father mentioned a new restructuring plan. Daniel laughed. I guarantee the people making those decisions have never even stepped into the regional offices. His father nodded. That's probably true. I sat quietly across the table, because the restructuring plan he was criticizing was one I had approved 3 months earlier. Have you ever sat in a room listening to people discuss decisions you personally made while they assume you had nothing to do with them? At first, it almost felt amusing, a strange kind of social experiment. But over time, something about it became heavier, because Daniel never asked, not once, not about the board, not about ownership, not about the structure of the company his father had spent years working for. To him, I was simply his wife. Someone whose career existed somewhere in the vague world of finance. Someone who probably handled spreadsheets, meetings, nothing more. And the longer he believed that, the more comfortable he became speaking with quiet superiority. Not cruel, just certain. Certain that the room belonged to him. Certain that leadership was something he understood better than the people actually running the company. What he never realized was that the person signing off on major decisions was sitting across the breakfast table every morning. The first moment I truly realized how far Daniel's assumptions had gone happened during a company event. It was a formal reception for senior staff and their families. Nothing dramatic. Just a quiet evening in one of the downtown hotels our company frequently used for corporate gatherings. On soft lighting, waiters moving through the room with trays of drinks, executives discussing quarterly reports in low voices. Daniel seemed especially comfortable that night. His father introduced him to several managers from different departments. Daniel shook hands confidently, speaking with the relaxed tone of someone who felt completely at home. This place runs because of people like us, he told one of them with a friendly laugh. The manager nodded politely. Across the room, I noticed a few board members arriving. They greeted me with small nods, professional, discreet, just enough acknowledgement to show they recognized me without drawing attention. Daniel didn't notice any of it. He was too busy explaining to someone how leadership often misunderstood operational realities. Have you ever watched someone confidently explain something, not realizing the person beside them has the authority to change the entire situation? Later in the evening, Daniel joined a conversation between several senior employees. I stood nearby, listening quietly. One of them mentioned a major investment decision the company had made earlier that year. Daniel shook his head immediately. Management probably rushed it, he said. The people making those decisions rarely understand the risks. The group fell silent. Not because they were offended, but because they knew exactly who had approved that investment, and they also knew I was standing right there. One of the executives cleared his throat and glanced at me. Daniel didn't notice. He continued speaking confidently about leadership mistakes and corporate arrogance. I remember watching the expressions around the table carefully. Some looked uncomfortable, others looked amused. But one thought crossed my mind very clearly in that moment. If Daniel ever discovered the truth about who actually owned the company, over time something inside me slowly changed. Not anger, more like distance. Because there's a moment in certain relationships when you realize explaining the truth would only create more noise. Daniel liked the idea of authority, the sound of it, the way people reacted when he spoke confidently about business. Correcting him would not have helped him grow, it would have simply embarrassed him. So instead, I stopped trying to adjust his perspective. I listened, observed, let conversations unfold exactly as they naturally would. At home, Daniel often described the company like it was a puzzle he understood better than the people running it. They should bring in fresh leadership, he once said during dinner. Someone who actually knows what they're doing. I set my fork down slowly. Maybe they already have, I replied. He laughed. Trust me. I'd know. Would he? That question stayed quietly in my mind for weeks, not because I wanted to prove him wrong, but because sometimes the truth reveals itself without effort. And eventually, a moment arrived when the company scheduled its annual board review meeting, a formal session where major decisions were presented and approved. Daniel had never attended one before, but that year something unusual happened. His father invited him. "Come see how real business works," his father told him proudly. Daniel was excited. I could see it immediately. He spent the entire week talking about it, what he would observe, what he expected to hear, what leadership might finally realize. The morning of the meeting, he put on his best suit. "I'll finally get a look at the people running this place," he said confidently. I nodded calmly, because I knew something he didn't. When the board meeting began later that afternoon, Daniel would finally meet the person who actually owned the company. And for the first time since we met, that conversation would not happen across our kitchen table. The boardroom felt colder than usual that afternoon. Long glass windows overlooked the city skyline. A polished oak table stretched across the center of the room, surrounded by executives who had worked in the company for years. Daniel walked in beside his father, looking impressed. I entered a few minutes later. He barely noticed me at first. To him, I was simply attending another corporate meeting. The chairman began the session with a short introduction. Quarterly reports, department updates, investment reviews. Daniel listened carefully, occasionally leaning toward his father and whispering comments about how the meeting should be run. Then the chairman paused. "There is one more matter," he said calmly. He turned toward the end of the table. "Before we continue, I want to formally acknowledge the majority owner of the company." Daniel's chair shifted slightly. The room grew quiet. And slowly, every person in the room turned to look at me. Daniel followed their gaze. At first, his expression showed confusion, then disbelief. "Wait, what?" he said quietly. The chairman continued calmly. "As most of you know, the company's controlling shares have been held in a private trust since the passing of our founder." He gestured politely in my direction. "And the primary beneficiary of that trust is Mrs. Carter." No one spoke. Daniel looked from the chairman to me, then back again. For the first time since I had known him, he had absolutely nothing to say. Have you ever watched someone's entire understanding of a situation collapse in real time? That was the moment it happened. For a long moment, the room remained silent, not uncomfortable, just still. The kind of silence that appears when everyone suddenly understands something important at the same time. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair. His father looked stunned. My executives around the table remained professional, but I could see the small shifts in their expressions. Many of them had already known the truth for years. They simply hadn't expected Daniel to discover it this way. The chairman continued the meeting like nothing unusual had happened. Reports resumed, decisions were discussed, votes were taken, business moved forward. Daniel barely spoke. When the meeting ended, people stood and began gathering their documents. My husband remained seated for a moment longer. Finally, he looked at me. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly. I considered the question. Then I gave the only honest answer I had. "You never asked." Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive with anger or revenge. Sometimes it simply appears in a quiet room, at the exact moment someone realizes how much they misunderstood. And strangely enough, that moment can change everything. If you were in that room, how would you have reacted? Comment below.